Welcome back, YouTube, and today we've got another tier list video. As we enter the WCQ season, a brand new set is being released, Infinite Forbidden, and I'm sure it's on everybody's mind as we go to the most important tournament of the year, which deck is the best deck to play. But then also how Infinite Forbidden may augment current decks and the new themes from that set may fit into the metagame. So let's take a look at what the best decks are going to be in the upcoming format. Before I begin, if you enjoy the meta-relevant content where we go over tier lists for the best decks, please like, subscribe, leave a comment down below on your thoughts on the tier list, if I've said anything you don't agree with, or if you have any suggestions. Also, next week we will have a tier list again, but this time for the staple cards in the format. Okay, so before we get into the actual tier list itself, let's discuss the parameters by which we judge the cards. The tiers, if you will. This one's a bit weird because I think there's kind of two different ways of looking at this. The decks that really will shape the format and people will build around. Specifically for this format as well, I want to talk about the decks I feel like will give you the highest chance of earning a World Championship qualification spot if you're competing in the European WCQ or the North American WCQ over the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to classify these decks first here into the more classical tier list that I've done before, with the driving forces well positioned and such. And then I'll also put decks afterwards into a tier list on what will give you the highest chance of qualifying for the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship in September. So quickly, let's talk about the first tier list here. Now, the top category is going to be the driving forces of the format. So these are ones where they will shape how the rest of the format is built. Decks will have to be prepared to beat these top decks, whether it be their non-engine or their engine has to line up well into what the main deck does here for the driving forces. So even if one of the themes isn't the best, like Senpai was last time, it will no doubt have a huge significant impact on the format, and if you aren't prepared for it, you will not really have success in a tournament, at least you're unlikely to. I'm also going to have the well-positioned category. These are themes that I feel like are the best positioned to take advantage of the weaknesses of any of the driving forces and leave themselves in a good spot. These decks usually have contrasts with the driving forces in the sense that the cards that are good against the driving force decks aren't good against your well-positioned decks. We're also going to have the strongest engine portion. The strongest engine are the decks with the strongest engines. The strongest engine tier will be kind of self-explanatory. Decks I feel like have really strong engines to kind of make up for maybe not being the absolute driving force that the dominant decks are, but also not in a terrible position overall. This was kind of hard for me to distinguish. In the last video, I kind of had a strong tier section, but I felt like there is a distinction to be made between decks that are the strongest and decks that are just strong. Because in reality, not all decks are created equal, and I think a distinction does need to be made. So on that topic, we also got the strong engines that are more awkwardly positioned. So things that can be carried by their brute power, but their non-engine doesn't line up as well, or their engine doesn't line up as well into the non-engine of the format and such. We're also going to have a lesser well-positioned decks, and this is decks that have a lot of good lineups into the metagame. Again, thanks to engine parallels or being good against the non-engine that other decks play that are popular in the format. And then we have decks that are poorly positioned or just bad in general. And these are things I really recommend not playing because they've just not going to hold up in the current circumstance. So next thing I want to talk about is what changes with Infinite Forbidden. Well, obviously we're going to have a couple of new themes. We're going to have the Fiendsmith theme and the Millennium theme. Millennium theme is not one to write home about. I think the Millennium theme by itself isn't very impactful. However, as an engine, it's not bad for generating a couple bodies. However, when it comes to generating free bodies, one engine does it way better. Also brand new, that is the Fiendsmith package, and this will augment a lot of current decks. If your deck has the ability to summon 2 monsters, you can make the Goddess of the Closed Moon. And that monster will then turn into your Fiendsmith Requiem, which will then turn your Fiendsmith cards. And in turn, you can get access to rank 6s like Beatrice, or Nib Installation via cards like Appaloosa, or Wave King Caesar, or it could turn into just a bunch of Link fodder. You can kind of see where I'm going here. Options are very endless. Infinite Forbidden will also bring us a couple new hand traps, Dominus Purge and Multichummy Perilia. Dominus Purge being an attribute-specific hand trap that functions similar to Ash, but only on Rhoda-esque effects, cards that deck add from deck to hand. And Multichummy Perilia is a maxi budget because it can only be used with no cards in field, but also will only give a draw every time a monster is summoned from the hand. However, will also count normal summons. So that does impact some decks in this format and will shape some of what my process is for decision making and quality of deck choice here. Okay, I think that covers most of the information. Let's get into the actual rankings and we'll go from there. Let's start off with what decks belong in the driving forces category. First up is none other than Snake Eye. And I'm going to call it pure Snake Eye here, but in reality, this deck has stopped becoming this same sort of pure Snake Eye that we may have had before. Now, Snake Eye is going to play Fiendsmith. The Fiendsmith cards with the new Light Fiend Link 2 enable extra ability to play on hand traps, because now if you get, say, Valor Impermed on your Witch plus Snake Eye Ash, you can convert them into another line of play now. It also means that when you're playing through fields, you're going to have more ability to push through interruptions. The Fiendsmith cards aren't just extra bodies, though. One of the fusions, DS Array, it's not exactly in every single deck list we look at on the OCG, but it pops up enough to know that it's a high chance you can play against it at a high-level tournament. What it does is it's almost like Hot Ragged Dragon Archfiend. Quick effect, you can target any number of cards in the field, up number of links that are equipped to it, which the Fiendsmith cards do, and then you can negate their effects. So this is a great way of mitigating board breakers now. So now Snake Eye has a better tool for breakers. And this essentially acts as an Omni to replace cards like Baron and Savage, which were otherwise banned. What's cool about this card, however, is it actually gives you an out to cards like Dark Ruler more or Droplet, not just evenly matched type cards. Because if your opponent goes Dark Ruler and you have any chainable spell or trap card, you can chain the spell or trap and then chain your DS Array, because like Hot Dragon Archfiend, and unlike Savage, you don't have to chain directly to the card you're trying to negate. So Snake Eyes gets improvements in every sort of fashion here. It's a strict upgrade in every way. So the dominant deck in the meta only got better. Which is just crazy. Now, other decks will use Fiendsmith. Any deck that really can put up the bodies and isn't going to lock yourself out of the Light or Fiend archetype typing, then you're going to want to play it most likely. So what does that mean for everything else? It means that you want to either combat Snake Eye with a heavy board breaker lineup, or you want to pair together large numbers of hand traps, 3+. Now, the distinction of the Fiendsmith cards here is now 2 hand traps is not nearly as safe. This means the minimum number of non-engine required for me to be comfortable with a well-positioned deck has changed. And I think decks only like 12 or so non-engine spots now aren't enough. I think this reflects most in decks like Voiceless Voice, a deck where you had non-engine spaces, but you didn't have the same high level that maybe like a Snake Eye Mirror Match did or a Tempai did. And I think rather, if you only have 12 spots, to try bridge 2-card combinations together. And if you're trying to do that, the best way to do that is with board breakers instead. Now, it is a bit more fluky because especially at the beginning of format, when you don't know the exact end board people are going to end on, it's hard to target down specific things. Personally, I prefer the hand chip approach, and I'll talk about more of that next week. But by that reason, I think that will affect a lot of the rest of the deck rankings, and we'll go into that as we talk about them more. Now, the other big driving force in the metagame is going to be Tempai, and Tempai is getting new support in Infinite Forbidden. We're going to get the Poke Draco card, or Dora Draco, a new starter for the deck because it adds any Fire Dragon, and specifically, you're going to be adding a card called Tenpai Genroku, which is just Tenpai Poplar. When it's added to hand, it summons itself, and you can turn it into a tuner if you want. Then you can tribute it off the same way you would with the original, special summon any Tenpai from the deck. They also got one of the new trap cards, but all in all, those 3 cards don't really augment the deck's ability to go first. You could have some gimmicky way to pull off some combos, at least from my testing, I still feel like this deck is primarily go second deck. Now, that being said, you can fit a large suite of non-engine in here. So that's why this deck can thrive. You can easily build your deck in a way where you're likely to draw 3 hand traps. And versus other decks that aren't Snake Eye, you're still pretty well favored. Your cards are efficient, they're not weak into hand traps, and you have a limited number of bricks, meaning your hands should look pretty good every single time. The biggest problem with this deck is that you're going second. It is a huge flaw, and being synchro and battle phase driven also means that there's a lot more silver bullets that can hurt you. Cards like Threatening Work can hurt you way more than they realistically should. But that being said, if your opponent doesn't prepare for it, this deck will roll through a tournament. Because I think if all non-engine is directed towards Snake Eye, and 0, side deck included, is directed towards Tenpai, then Tenpai could actually run away with the tournament fairly easily. That being said, I think most people are diligent enough to know that they have to prepare for Tenpai. It is going to be a large shaper of the metagame. Decks with a bad matchup versus Tenpai, they suffer a decent bit. And decks should be gearing their non-engine, at least in some way, to Tenpai. Snake Eye is the same. Cards like Rise to Full Heights is a popular card to send off Beatrice, post-side, or even in some tournaments we've seen being played in the main deck. Perhaps the rank 1s like Kikinikishi Fucho or Lyrilisk will both be used by decks like Snake Eye to stop the damage from the Tenpai deck. So like the last list, I don't think it changes. These 2 are the biggest driving forces in the metagame. That brings us on to the well-positioned decks in the format. And as far as what's well-positioned, I think there's only one deck that is actually well-positioned, because I think there's a problem. I talked before how now you want 3 hand traps instead of 2 to comfortably feel safe against Snake Eye. And with 3 hand traps, it eliminates a lot of the viable decks that would otherwise be well positioned. And so the best way to counter that has been an uptick of decks that play breakers. High engine with breaker decks bully those mid-range decks that would have been otherwise okay, like Salomon Great, Marincess, Labyrinth before. So I feel like it pushes those decks out of being well positioned now, because now they're not just facing hand trap decks. And ultimately, what it leaves me is the only deck I can confidently say I think is actually in a good position that is not a driving force in the metagame is Runic Stun. Because this deck is not weak to breakers or hand traps. The only breaker it is weak to is Evenly Matched, a card that I think is probably one of the worst breakers. And I guess Back Removal, which overall are not the really cards you typically put in as breakers in the current format. And with everyone preparing so much their side deck now to max up the number of hand traps they feel okay post side, it really leaves you in a weird position. This deck can just absolutely destroy you, because it's criminal where you have so little agency sometimes in how the game goes, you'll just get obliterated. Skill Drain is a phenomenal card, and there's other floodgates that are insane as well. Tyrant's Tirade is one we've been seeing more and more as well. They can play cards to break boards like Sphere Mode, Lava Golem, their normal summon not being too important. And most of the time, one of the best cards that are good as defensive options aren't going to be good versus the Runic Stun deck. Like, Appaloosa does very little, and Espial Knight does just a little bit. If you're looking at dealing with this, one thing that I'd recommend is trying to end on the new fusion, Fiendsmith DS Array. Because there will be a negate, but also one of the Fiendsmith links does give you the ability that when it's equipped, the monster you equip it to is untargetable. One of the main methods of removal for the Runic engine. This, I think, is great because it'll give you a way to stop floodgates, stop runing spells, and opponent's return. Being untargetable means it'll be a huge priority for your opponent to deal with. But if they don't draw one of their strict removal cards like Lava Golem and Sphere Mode, it might just not be able to clear it. But even with all that in mind, it does require a decent bit of foresight in the opponent to know the matchup, to be prepared for it, and still requires the Runic Stun to not then draw their outs to that card, right? Because as a Runic Stun player who's being diligent, they'll have to prepare for those type of answers. The answers for Runic Stun are going to be limited, because even people who are preparing for this deck, it feels like they're putting 3 side deck cards in max to beat it, cards like Cosmo Cyclone. At the end of the day, that does leave a lot up to chance, and there's a good chance Runic Stun could just run away with everything. So it's a deck that I feel like is the only deck that is truly well positioned. All right, the next tier to look at is the strongest engine tier. And first I want to talk about the Despia branded deck, because the Puppet Lock is strong as ever, and it can play through boards to a decent extent, to the point where if you back it up with some proper board breakers, you can actually do rather solid into a lot of decks, especially the more rogue ones that were more mid-range and trying to just jam a bunch of hand traps in, deal with Snake Eye, but then their combo of their own really wasn't that powerful. Now, in some degree, you could argue a deck like this is going to be a driving force in the meta, but I felt like the actual driving force behind a deck like Despia was the fact that now we've seen an uptick of these pseudo FTK decks, like Rika or Gimmick Puppets in the future, or Despia, that would then play this board breaker package as opposed to a heavy hand trap lineup. But as for the engine itself, because each of these different pseudo FTK engines is ranked differently, I want to talk about their own merits. And I think Despia's is one of the strongest because it feels like it's, for the most part, one of the hardest to hand traps. It has a lot of different ways to combo as well. It's really hard to know when you should be trying to choke your opponents in certain spots. And then some of the best cards, you just can't even stop. I think the Branded Loss stopping you, your ability to respond, or Albion Sanctifier saying you can't target. You really have to try to stop them early, and oftentimes you just don't have a good outlet to do so. But even if you do, the deck does have a good grind game and good natural disruption without relying on their single FTK. Another good thing about their FTK is it's typically not weak to any sort of opposing board breakers. Where some pseudo FTKs like Rika are a bunch of negates, which, albeit very strong, it doesn't immediately end the game the same way Puppet Lock has pretty much zero recourse. The second it's in play, unless you're playing Gimmick Puppet deck, you are just boned. One of the biggest problems I do have with Despia, and that hasn't changed, is how it gets caught a bit in the Dimensional Barrier Crossfire from Tenpai being such a popular deck. I think if Despia existed without Tenpai in the format, Barrier would not be in people's decks, which is another reason why I wouldn't put Despia as a driving force per se. That being said, this is a deck I'd be kind of scared to play, because a big problem with any of these breaker decks, like as I said before, is that you don't know what end boards people are going to be playing on. For one, mirror matches between pseudo FTK decks are just coin flips for the most part, but then also, like, you never know that if Snake Eyes prepare more for Despia, they could just put a searchable way to beat you, right? Like Beatrice now is accessible in Snake Eye very easily, and Beatrice can do anything in the world they want. They could set mid-range cards that require less bricks, like Black Goat Laughs or Keldo, to bolster their field. But I feel like that's not enough because you're playing very, very like high engine, like aggro deck. They could send Angel of Blue Tears, which says when it goes to the grave, and your opponent, and you'll damage your opponent, which the Fiendsmith level 6 material will do when it gets attached. It can banish yourself from the grave to set any normal trap in your deck, and then you can use it that turn. So you could search and then set Dimensional Barrier and use it. You could also send a Floodgate from deck to grave and make Nightmare Griffin and reset it. You could also go Beatrice to send Transaction Rollback, and then Beatrice again on their turn to send the trap card Maikashi. which will just say you can't summon anything. And if I'm going for pseudo FTK deck, this is probably the best one, barring maybe one other choice, but it's arguable where it stands. And that would be Yugioh. So Yugioh is kind of hard for me personally to classify because I do think it evolves in the strongest engine, but it can almost be broken up into two different sects. One that is way more combo driven with more Unchained cards, and its end field is infinitely stronger. This feels almost like the pseudo FTK version. Your number of non-engine is drastically lowered in return, but your ability to play through hand traps goes up through the roof, and your end board and power goes up through the roof, to the point where I feel like board breakers don't work against you, and to the point where hand traps don't work against you. However, in return, going second becomes a lot worse because you're relying on engine and the very scarce board breaker non-engine you do have to break through fields. But then there's the other version of the deck, and then this is the more traditional approach to the deck that we've seen being played in OCG, which I think is unfortunately better right now because you need the more non-engine. That's play a hand trap lineup. This is where you can fit around 15 or so non-engine into the deck, and then in return you still have a powerful suite of Yubel cards, so it's a small Unchained package. You also have this weirdly good Tenpai matchup because they just can't deal with your Yubels. So that sounds pretty appealing, right? But the one problem I have with Yubel here is it actually ends up being pretty similar to Snake Eye. You have solid 1-card combos, and you have good 2-card combos and 3-card combos. Your deck actually bridges together very well. You have some bricks in the deck that aren't the worst to draw because you can use them, but are ultimately not good to draw, the same way Snake Eye would have your Snake Eye Balsto or Flamebridge, maybe to a lesser extent in Yubel. They really actually just seem very similar when you compare them. So, where does it leave Yubel? So, my problem with it is, I think it is a little bit worse in hand traps if you're playing the high hand trap count. Are more games that feel like you lose to Ash Blossom than there are in the Snake Eye deck, specifically on the effect attribute Samsara D Lotus. You could get ashed and it's very rough, where Snake Eye I feel like has less critical points to that specific moment. I also feel like the Yubel deck just can't play as much non-engine as the Snake Eye deck, which means that if these decks are doing the same thing and you have to compare them head to head, which one is better, it's just going to be Snake Eye. I still think that hand traps the way you want to be approaching the Yubel matchup. And Snake Eye is the same, so there's really not much of an edge there. That's why it ends up in this part of the list. I don't want to undersell Yubel's power because I think it's an incredibly good deck, but I do think it just gets outshone by Snake Eye in every way. And those are all the strong decks. Now I feel like we've shifted to way more of a top-heavy dynamic here. The metagame feels really centered on these few decks. But next up, let's talk about some of these strong engines that are more awkwardly positioned. And that first one I got is Fire King Snake Eye. Similarly to Yubel, you can't play as much non-engine as you can in the pure Snake Eye deck. However, I also feel like it just matches up worse now. Destruction feels to be worse versus Yubel. And before, where you gave you more removal, you now just aren't as good because the Fiendsmith cards do it for you in the pure deck. And with even more and more like ways to combo and make these strong fields, especially that are Appaloosa centric, a card that's notoriously strong versus Fire King, it becomes hard to cope. It almost feels like the best way to approach Fire King now is to then shift towards a board breaker approach. But the reality is, if you're doing that, then you're not playing a pseudo FTK deck. While your end board is incredibly strong, it's still less than an Espia deck, and in reality probably less than like a Yubel deck as well. But you're also giving up hand traps, so now like it is more possible for your board to be broken, and overall leaves you in this position where, despite your engine being pretty strong, it doesn't feel like it's ever correct. And we've seen this in OCG, where with the new Fiendsmith cards, Fire King's fallen off the map for a large part of it. Whereas in Master Duel, where a lot of the hits are the same with Snake Eye package, but Ulcanix is legal, Fire King sees play. I think if the same thing would happen in Master Duel and Fiendsmith cards came out, we'd see Fire King start to rotate in the same fashion. Next up on this list, I want to talk about a brand new deck, or a deck that got brand new support in this Ritual Beast. I know a lot of people are interested in talking about this deck. And I feel like this deck suffers from a similar problem to a lot of the decks like Voice's Voice, where your hand trap lineup isn't like super set. It's like 12 hand traps. You can push 15 if you really want to break out more of the your engine cards. So it means you're not going to be able to compete with these high hand trap count decks like Tenpai or Snake Eye. So in a lot of ways, you're strictly worse. But you do have cards that you can maybe switch to more of a breaker approach. Go like 12 breakers, then put a little more oomph into the engine. So you're better off going first, and you are okay going second. The other upsides with Ritual Beast is if you go for the hand trap approach, you have access to cards like Dominus Purge, which would otherwise not be too impactful for this deck. And you also can play cards like Dimensional Shifter, the still best hand trap in the game. And you also get access to searchable cards like Protos, which turns all your combos into pseudo FTKs. Because your combos otherwise are decently strong and solid into most hand traps, barring Nibiru. But the deck does come with downsides. And I think the biggest one outside of the non-engine count is going to be how bad it is into removal. Now, note how I said it wasn't great into Nibiru, and I think that really shines when you go second. And I've seen this in testing as well. If your opponent is playing like a Snake Eye combo and they end on their Flame Burge with IP, you don't have a great way of dealing with that. Even with non-engine like Dark Root or more, Temple can just bring up the IP. SP on the normal summon is really hard to deal with because there's still the SP float again for a second piece of removal, and until you can establish bodies, you kind of just don't have any great options. It's a deck that once it gets developed is rather strong, but the issue is getting developed. Reminds me of Manadium in a way, where it's good into negation but bad into removal. And when you're expecting SP to happen every game, that's really rough. Now, one trick I've seen people do is they'll go threatened to battle phase versus the IP stuff. And what the goal is there is if your opponent thinks you're playing evenly matched, they'll IP into SP to give yourself some safety and some follow-up in case you do get evening. However, if you're playing versus Ritual Beast, do not do this. This is the best piece of interrupt against them. The negation you have otherwise is not going to be nearly as impactful. And this is most likely a bait. You should rather let it happen if it does happen and it's worth it, because if they don't and they were trying to bluff you, then the SP alone should win you the game. Powerful combos, powerful engine, but a big glaring weakness I'm not thrilled about. Next up, I'm going to talk about Rika, the planned invasion that seems to constantly do well in Europe. Truthfully, I have no idea why. I feel like this deck is just worse than Despia. It's accomplishing a very similar thing. In the sense you have a really powerful turn 1 setup, and you pair it with a high count of board breakers, and then in order to decrease the density of bricks in your deck, because you have a lot of shitty 1-ofs, you play high deck count. Very similar to Despia in a lot of ways. This deck is still a board breaker deck, which I'm not a fan of in this current climate, even if it has some potential. And it will mean that it will be a lot of other matchups like versus Despia, where you're just coin flipping, and not where I want to go with a deck ever. Next up on the list is Centurion, a deck that in theory should have some promise, as with the new support, it does have a little bit more ability to extend. It also has the ability to pseudo FTK with cards like Calamity, and you can play a large number of hand traps. Now, the biggest problem with this deck is its fragility to hand traps. If hand traps were good, but no deck could afford to fit them in and thus play board breakers, this deck would be a lot better, but that's not how it is. The best deck, Snake Eye, will in itself play a lot of hand traps. So if you're playing versus Snake Eye and you're trading hand traps, even if it seems like, oh yeah, I got the triple hand trap and then he stops, if your next play is a summon Centurion monster, the Veiler, and you pass, you're not actually really progressing your game state that much. Now, another problem with this deck is it's not actually foolproof into breakers. It's not like you're Calamity locking in the draw phase. You're Calamity locking in main phase pretty much most of the time. That means this card like Dark Ruler can hit you. And if you're relying on coming out of the spell and trap card zone to synchro on their turn as well, then now you're gonna have to deal with back removal being a threat. It's not completely invulnerable. I'd say compared to Despia, Despia not invulnerable either, I guess. But if we're going in terms of which is safer to resolve on the opponent's turn, I still think Despia is better. So Centurion falls here on the list. Now, another engine that I think is very good is Lightsworns. I still have faith in this deck. However, we're in the same predicament as last time. This deck's biggest fault is it can't play a high non-engine count, and that will really hinder you here. This deck's engine is very strong, and it can do almost anything you want in the game. However, as a result of its deck construction, it will not be able to compete at the top level. Just, you need the circumstances that matter, the driving force. You need hand traps. This deck can't do it. Not where I want to be. Next up, we got Rescue Ace, a deck which has pretty solid engine, and I think if we are seeing an uptick in board breakers that are dictated towards monster negation, then being able to rescue Ace Turbulence, set 4 cards is a pretty good way to mitigate that. That being said, I find the deck brickier. You have less non-engine than other decks. I think it's in the Voice realm of like 12-ish hand traps, which not where I want to be. Again, that's below par in terms of where the standard I set for having hand traps. And you play this deck as a board breaker deck, then there's a chance your board's not powerful enough, because there are some boards where you're just ending on set 4 pass. Moving on to another deck with a lot of new support that really reshapes its entire strategy, and that is Gimmick Puppets. Focusing on FTK really, with a broken field spell that makes your cards immune the same way Singing and Summoning does. This deck is on a fair bit of radars. And that is because when you have the field spell up, it can play through hand traps pretty effectively. And when you go first, your opponent does not even get a turn. Even more FTK based than the Despia deck, because cards like Droplet just will not work. This deck is solid in that regard, where if you win the die roll, you should win the match. Now, there are some hand traps and then sometimes enough combinations that will beat you. But my problem with this deck is that when it goes second, it really fails to keep up. Even with the broken field spell like Tenpai, it doesn't function in the same way. There is enough spell and trap card removal in the format with cards like SP, Phoenix, and people are setting Cosmic, that you can just get absolutely owned on the field spell, and then your board gets cleared and it's not a problem anymore. I really just don't think this deck can compete going second. I know it's a common trend here, because I think a lot of these decks are forced into the breaker strategy, which can work sometimes, but not enough of the time for me to reliably put them at the top. And that's it for the strong engines that are awkwardly positioned. Let's talk about the lesser well-positioned decks. So decks that I feel like have some decent positioning, but just aren't as strong as Runic or still have flaws in their positioning. So the first deck I want to talk about here is also something that's starting to pop up more and more, and that is Ice Barrier Sprite. So, whoa, this deck won the South American WCQ, and it was a bit of a shocker, but this was on some people's radar beforehand. That's thanks to a card called Ice Barrier Mirror Mage, which when sent to the grave, will add the Ice Barrier Reborn spell. And it being level 2 Aqua means that Swap Frog can now become a 1-card totally awesome. So this really fixes some of the problems of the deck where its potency wasn't as high, and its ability to play through hand traps wasn't as high. But now it does both in a way more effective manner than you would before. Before, where you could summon Beaver and you could stop and hold the hand trap or something else, now you just can't. When they summon Swap Frog, you have to act immediately. Otherwise, you're going to get toaded, which is an insane card. And if you leave them uninterrupted to try and like break through the board with Engine, you're going to have a hard time because you're going to have Toad on top of the normal Sprite shenanigans, even though it's just like Smash or Carrot Red. Like, that's not bad at all. Obviously, with no Sprite Elf, you're not going to have the targeting protection, which is huge. You're not going to be able to revive the Toad, which is also huge. So it's not going to be like as insane. But as far as an engine goes, it is still a huge increase in the power of the deck. Now, another upside of the deck is you can fit a fair number of non-engine in here. I wouldn't say it pushes the exact upper bounds that Snake Eye does. And I think overall that means you can play hand traps. Now, my bigger problem with this deck is I think it is worse going second. Sprite has always had the issue of being good into negation, but bad into removal. Which sets it up well for going first, but means going second, it's going to be a bit harder to push through things. I think comparing Sprite to Snake Eye in terms of ability to play through a board, Snake Eye can play from hand easier with cards like Black Witch, where in Sprite, it's only starter really to get you started once again. You may have to play cards like E-Telly to go through that, but now with Gamma 1, that feels not worth it unless you want to play Delta, but that's all kind of going second only type of things, which are pretty iffy. So yeah, that's kind of like my reservations with the Sprite deck. Next up on the list, I want to talk about Kashtira, a deck that I think is really overlooked as a strong stun option. It is similar to Runic Stun in the sense where you're just trying to take advantage of the fact that most on engine is unaffected against you. That being said, end board pieces that are removal based, like Promethean Princess, are going to be good against you if you're playing Kashtira, where they would not be when you're playing Runic Stun. So I think it lines up worse than the Runic Stun deck is, but in return you get to play some better cards like D-Shifter, and you can actually enter weird grind games and scrappy grind games where Fenrir and Unicorn can clutch it by themselves. You can also argue they're better into rogue decks because the Kashtira cards are great versus these roguer, weaker strategies, and the Runic deck might just lose to some random deck that has built-in back or removal, so it's a bit more all around. And you can build this deck very anti-graveyard with cards like D-Fissure, Macrocosmos, Gravekeeper Inscription. So you can still very build this in the anti-meta fashion. But it's just like an old classic stun deck. You stick a strong, high-value monster with some floodgates, and you watch your opponent squirm. That is what Kashtira is. It does that solidly. That won't change for a while. Next thing I want to talk about is Salamangreat. Salamangreat is a deck that I think is great. A lot of my other mid-range decks have fallen off in terms of where I feel like they're positioned in the metagame. Salamangreat, while not being fantastic into breakers, is a bit of the exception. I think that with its new support, it can actually keep up versus breakers not that bad. Oftentimes you'll end on both traps, the pop, the rage, and the roar, and the negate. So like the Rescue Ace deck where your cards felt rather, your Dark Ruler and Wars felt rather weak into the Salamangreat board, that's still going to be the same way here with the Salad cards. The traps will protect you from a lot of these main breakers, and your deck can play a solid number of hand traps to then combat the Snake Eye opponent. But I feel like it still overall has the same problem that Salad has always had. Playing into removal, like with a Sprite deck, is just a massive pain in the ass. I think as opposed to Sprite, this deck can maybe play a little bit better through fields, because the deck has some new tools to go through to boards. You can play Cyno Mining, obviously, for Gazelle. Mirror is kind of popular within Circle. Gets you playing into one removal a bit easier. But one removal, obviously, is not a high standard. Most decks put up more than one removal. But however, in return, what you lose is you lose to Nibiru more often. Main way this deck will play through Nibiru is with Weasel. Be conscious of that if you're playing with it or against it. But still, if you can stop them from putting Princess in the grave and still Nibiru a bunch of their bodies, it becomes increasingly hard for them to go through it. And that does hold it back greatly from being a top tier deck. The last deck I have in the lesser well positioned deck is Pearly. Yeah, I still think this deck is kind of weird for me to discuss because it has very strong attributes. The field spell, again, broken into cards like Veiler, Emperor, and Mourner, which are popular. Your end field with Pearly Noir is very strong. Noir is a fantastic card, and it draws you cards. And if you're just drawing into like 4 cards, which are hand traps, plus the Noir, you should just be safe. Going second, this deck can you just fine as well. You have really strong plays with Happy, Zeus, Pretty Memories, good to suck up monsters as well. So the deck is solid, but it's weird because in some ways this deck can be so good versus board breakers. Then other ways, when you play it, it just shits the bed into breakers. And then in the hand traps, it's the same. Some hands you'll draw, you have Street and some Pearly cards. and hand traps do nothing against you. Other hands, you'll get ashed and you'll lose. So while the deck has a great capacity to be strong, I think it ultimately does have flaws that hold it back from being the absolute height that I want for a well-positioned or strong or Dragon Force deck. Okay, so those are all the main decks I wanted to talk about. We also have decks that are poorly positioned and are bad choices overall. So let me talk about a couple of those that I may have otherwise not expected. One of those is Labyrinth, a deck that I talked about more highly in the past list of being well-positioned. My problem with it is Snake Eye gets only even better at playing through hand traps, and not trying to stop them in that capacity is not good. And trying to beat them with trap cards to clear their field is also harder now because of, one, DS Array. The Fiends with cards in general are an infinite source of resources. You can't just like pop their Link 2 and then say, okay, now that's gone. They'll just shuffle it back and do it again. As well as just gives them another free body every turn and a free pop every turn, which will keep you off of getting your tempo and will force you to commit more resources into stopping them. So now it feels like more than ever, you need to commit more spots towards graveyard removal, and it just feels almost impossible to tackle every aspect of the Snake Eye or Tenpai deck all at once. Tenpai is actually still an easy matchup. Don't get it twisted. It's just Snake Eye, I feel like it gets rougher and rougher. Next up is Voice's Voice, and I've used this one as an example previously in the video, and it's simple. I think your end fields are weaker in breakers like Dark Ruler and Droplet, which you're seeing more play, which is a problem. But also, your deck can't even play a high number of hand traps to combat the new improved Snake Eye combos. It leaves you in a bad position overall. I don't know why you'd want to play this deck, and the deck's not like specifically consistent either. It can also brick itself. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me. It's a combo deck, not really a combo deck, but like it's a weird mid-range deck that I feel like is just worse than other options. Next up is a new Millennium theme. This is cool because you get to summon this Exodia fusion that's an omni-negate and that's broken and all, but I feel like it was worth mentioning because the Exodia cards are brand new, but this deck will not keep up in terms of competitiveness. Locking yourself out of other monsters for the most part is really rough. Paying a lot of life points is also rough because it means decks can kill you easier. And while life points isn't like a huge deal, it just means that if they can break through the field slightly, what they need now to kill you and not let you get your follow-up is less significant, which does come up, especially when decks build up such strong follow-up nowadays. Next up on the list is Marincess, a deck I did rate more highly before. However, Marincess is great with negates. Setting up cards like Marincess Wave is fantastic as a way to stop Snake Eye Ash. However, the Fiends with cards, and now that every deck can turn into Fiends with cards when they develop two bodies, means that negates in general are just worse. If you're not negating and destroying, your opponent has more ability to push past what you are stopping. And as other decks only improved and Marincess hasn't gotten better at all, I feel like it's kind of left in the dust in terms of where I want it to be. Next up, Infernoid, a deck with brand new support that I think is quite cool and needs to be explored more. I think the way you'd want to play this though is with Snake Eyes, and you could build it in a pseudo FTK fashion where you play breakers in the deck because you combo with like Void Imagination when you go second. And when you go first, you can do the Infernoid FTK where you go like Bish Belkin and then Konami Machu Mech Burn for 8,000. I think that's a solid setup and not bad at all. However, it goes online with me just not wanting to play a lot of the breaker decks, and it's not very good. And then I also think that the Despy deck is probably less bricky at doing so and better at breaking boards, not dealing with all the high level Infernoid monsters that clunk your hand. But I also think people won't play it because it's new and no one's really explored it. If you guys want to see me talk about Infernoid more and give it more of a try, let me know, because it's something that I've been kind of wanting to do, but I find myself pressed for time unless you guys want to see me try whip up some Infernoid deck. That being said, I will use Snake Eye cards because there's just so much synergy that it would make no sense not to. Doing stuff like original for Decatron or a Flamebird to revive Decatron, or like use the Snake Eye Belster to put Decatron spell trap card zone and then temple it out on their turn as a negate is like so powerful that not being able to use those synergies would be almost like criminal. Moving on, Chimera, a deck that people tested last format with release of the Illusion Magician or Apprentice Magician, whatever it's called. It's not good. You can do Dark Barrier statue locks, but Dark Barrier statue is just not that good right now. Your board is just worse than other decks that play 12 hand traps. Can't play the right non-engine counts, and not a great board breaker deck either. So yeah, out of the race. And we got Heroes. Heroes is a cool deck, and while I appreciate that you can pseudo FTK with cards like Dark Angel, Plasma, and Dark Claw, it's still just not good. I think it's a glass cannon in a lot of ways. Are some easy choke points with hand traps, weakness to cards like Nibiru. Dark Ruler just brutalizes you a lot of the time, and you can't play the insane number non-engine that I think is required, so it's just the worst call than other decks. Next up is Tyr, a deck with a strong engine from last time. I feel like this deck is just strictly worse than the stronger engine decks now. It pains me to say that Tyr isn't what it used to be, but I can't really see the advantage of wanting to play Tyr now over in the other decks. Your very low non-engine count is very concerning, and yeah, that's really it. Next up is Fluanderies, a deck that I think has been terrible and is still terrible. Now you get access to Dominus Purge, new hand trap, cool. You can fit a decent number of non-engine here, so you can play some non-hand traps or some non-breakers. However, this deck is weak to Droll, which exists. It's weak to Veiler, Imperm Ash, which are all very popular. And this deck is also weak to now Multi-Champion Perillia. While people like are freaking out how powerful it is against this deck, it still probably gets you 3 draws, which is just insane. Don't worry, if you're not Featherstorming them and killing them the turn back, you'll probably just lose, because flu is flu. Let's also talk about the Whitewoods toy theme for a second. So what this deck does is you're going to be searching a bunch of the toy cards to give you fodder for Whitewoods effects, and the Whitewoods effects let you synchro up to powerful synchro monsters to synchro on your opponent's turn, book them in your opponent's fields, and just, yeah, make good synchros. But the thing is, synchros in general have hit a bit of a hard time with Baron and Savage being banned. They are just strictly weaker now. And then with this deck is, it relies a lot on 2-card combos. It's similar to the same vein you look at like Unchained. And those decks typically can play some non-engine, but not like an incredible high number non-engine. So like Voiceless, like Unchained, you're going to have probably around 12 non-engine in here. And that's not where you want to be. And in terms of power level of the combo, other things are just so powerful in comparison to what they do that why would I play Whitewoods over Despia, for example, if I'm comparing non-engine, or over Yubel? It's not your deck is specifically stronger in hand traps. I haven't found that to be the case. Despite having some really cool options like searching any spell trap from the grave, it's just not the same level of power as the other decks. And you can't play hand traps to compensate. So, yeah. All right, so that was tier list number 1. Talking about which decks are the driving forces and where they all fit in terms of positioning into the metagame. However, at a tournament like the WCQ, you have to go through 12 rounds of Swiss and then win 4 matches in Top Cut in order to get your World Championship spot. Go undefeated for 4 rounds where people know what you're playing. So you can't play like a Tempai that can expect to choose to go second every game. And you're going to have good matchup coverage spreads. So decks that are volatile or weak into a specific matchup, I feel like are way worse. Decks that have silver bullets are way worse. And decks that require a surprise factor are way worse as well. So I do think it changes some degree of the list. Let's talk about which decks I feel like are going to be the most represented in terms of world qualification spots, and which would give you the highest chance to qualify for Worlds if you were to take it to the tournaments in the next coming weeks. I'm not going to talk about each deck too much because we talked about it pretty much in depth already. So yeah, let's get to it. The highest chance deck is without a doubt Snake Eye Fiendsmith. I still think this is just the most powerful deck. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Play the strongest deck, master technical play, and maybe understand better combos. And a better non-engine lineup would be the ways to get advantage. But Snake Eye Fiendsmith is without a doubt the strongest deck. And even though Tempai is a driving force, it is not the same level of power or efficiency or invulnerability that Snake Eye has. Where it feels like if you just draw decent, not even broken, just decent, you can beat hand traps or breakers. Especially as you get to find out everyone's playing in Top Cut, and you can prepare for either or, it just gets even easier. Next up is what is a whole tier below and what gives you a decent chance, I think, and that is Yubel. I think Yubel is just Snake Eye Light. I think it has all the same attributes where you can play through hand traps or breakers appropriately with solid hands and play a solid number of non-engine. Your combos are very strong. It'll be decently played, so I think a lot of people will be playing Yubel, and they'll push up its chance of qualifying. A couple bit of outplays, a couple bit of getting lucky, or your opponent making mistakes against you, and this deck can get across the board to qualify for Worlds. Next up is the With Some Luck section. These are decks that were also at the top of the list before, but I feel like there's a bit more issues with them. That is Tenpai, Despia, and Runic Stun. Now, Tenpai, Runic Stun, Despia all have a bit of problems with matchup knowledge. If your opponent knows what you're playing, they can maybe prepare more effectively for it. This is specifically a problem with breakers. If they know what breakers you're playing, they can build boards around it. Overall, it just means that your game 1 matchup gets worse, where your game 1 should be really solid. So yeah, I think this does mean it way harder to win in a knockout round type tournament, like the top cut of a WCQ. The next 4 decks I have is Unlikely, but can get there based on the raw power of their engines. And that is 1, Ritual Beast. The deck can play enough non-engine that if you get lucky, you can get there. And going first, this deck is so broken that you can definitely steal wins. Similarly goes for Gimmick Puppets. I think that FTKing your opponent all day long and a deck that is more unknown, people make mistakes against it, even in Top Cut, is a real chance this deck could sneak its way into Top Cut, albeit unlikely. For similar reasons, I think Rika can get there. People still make mistakes against this plant deck. Still. Your boards are still strong. You play in hand traps decently, and you can play board breakers to punish your opponents. I think a lot of this one will come up on people not knowing how to play against the plant deck properly, which is just crazy that still happens, but still has a chance. Next up, we got the Fire King deck. I think that you still are playing Snake Eye cards at the end of the day, and these cards are powerful enough, and Fire King is strong enough as an engine, especially if you're playing versus the rogue decks that aren't Snake Eye, that this deck might be able to claw its way in here. This is probably the most iffiest in there. That being said, any of these like bottom 4 decks, I would not be surprised if none of those qualified for Worlds. Every other deck I mentioned here, I'd be surprised if it made it. Even the decks that had stronger engines, I think they just have better options you could pick instead of them. And I think that it doesn't make sense. They don't have much of a surprise factor. They don't have as much opportunity for opponents to make mistakes, or they're just overall not good positioned into the format. All right, so those are the 2 tier lists summing up the format. If you enjoyed the video, please give a like and subscribe. Because it goes a long way in showing me it's worth me sitting down here and talking to myself for a full hour. But I'm happy to do it if that's what you guys want to see. So let me know, and I'll see you guys all next time. Next week, we got the staple tier list. See you then.